Okay, good evening, everybody. Welcome back. Path of the Just, Mesilas Yesharim, finding our path in Avodas Hashem, finding our path to be closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We are now starting chapter 17, which is B'darkei Knias Hatara. We've talked up to this point about Tahara, about purity and taking only from this world what we absolutely need, purity in our thoughts as well, purity in Avodas Hashem. Now, and we talked about this, so to speak, as an object of desire, so to speak, the trait itself, the midah. What is this midah? So we discussed that in previous weeks. Now we're talking about more practically. Okay, fine. So how do you acquire this midah of tahara, this midah of purity? So he says something very interesting here, which is, I guess, counterintuitive. Hinei haderech lahasig hamidah hazos kalhu lemi shekava hishtadel vehisig hamidos hashnuyes ad hema. Somebody who's already got to this point, so to speak, and acquired everything we've spoken about before, all the midas so far on this ladder, on our path, on the path of the just, will find it easy to acquire the midah of tahara. Why is that? Why is that? So he says, because when a person, presumably you got to this point, up the ladder of reaching up in the Avodas Hashem, so you must have gone through quite a lot of hard work. What he's saying is that when a person considers and he thinks about the inferior nature of worldly pleasures, a person comes to despise them. It's not just that he comes to understand how worthless they are, how costly they are, how the pleasures of this world are very fleeting and sometimes very expensive in terms of his health maybe and his moral welfare. But the more a person thinks about this, when he considers, he contemplates, he comes to a point of despising them. Not just he doesn't want them anymore. Not that he's just keeping himself, the first stage is to keep yourself distant. The second stage is to not even desire them. But now it turns full circle. After you've got this far, to despise and to see them as evils, defects of a person's nature. Now, true, all of us are physical. And as we said many times, the nature of physicality is to go downward. Adam in Afar, man is created from earth, from dust, from dirt. So the nature of the physical part of a person tends to sink down. And of course, everything about this book is helping a person to raise himself up. But when a person gets to this point, and he spends a lot of time introspecting, understanding, examining, not just how worthless this world is, but how evil it can be. So when the truth of this, and again, this doesn't come so quickly, but if a person introspects, and of course all of this is about thinking, spending time, we've said this many times, spending time in the day to think about what am I supposed to be doing in this world? What is this world? What are the pleasures of this world? So when a person thinks about this, and of course he's got to this point, let's say he's done all the work up to this point, he's done his homework, so to speak, then he will find it easy, and I said something important here, to remove it, lahasim min haleiv. Not just to remove it from his action, not just to remove it from his thoughts, but to remove it from his heart. That by the time he's got to this point, he'll find this easy by thinking into how defective and how evil Olam Hazeh can be, is. And as I said before, the more time a person spends thinking about this and recognizing the rida, how yarud, how low are how lacking is the physicality and the pleasures of this world, then the more and more he thinks about this, the more he internalizes this, the more and more easy it becomes to purify himself, to free himself from these thoughts, and his heart will not want to turn to the Yetzer at all, the Yetzer Hara at all. In anything physical that he does, all his physical acts will be removed from a thought of impurity. And everything that, of course, as we've said this many times, we're physical beings, we're living in a physical world. But everything that he does, a person on this level, will be absolutely just what needs to be. The person needs to breathe, he needs to sleep, he needs to eat, he needs to have a certain degree of exercise, relaxation, he needs contact with his fellow human beings, he needs to be married, he needs... These things a person needs, but the needs will be coming from a place of compulsion. I'm a human being, I have to have these things. Okay. Now, just as we divided, and we spoke about before, tahara in terms of machshava, into two camps, two sections. One we dealt with bodily actions, how a person has to purify his thoughts when it comes to bodily actions, and the other when it comes to his avodas Hashem, that even in something spiritual like avodas Hashem, it's possible to have the wrong thoughts. The idea that people are seeing you, thinking of yourself as such a tzaddik, how holy I seem to other people, how to want covered, to be seen to be a tzaddik, etc., etc. So there are two distinct methodologies, operations, that a person is required to acquire these two areas of tahara, one in the physical world and the other in avodas Hashem. So, as we said before, we've already said this, but to purify, to be mataya a person's machshavos, his thoughts, with regard to the physical world. So as we said before, you have to constantly engage your thoughts in introspecting and thinking and understanding the inferior nature of this world and of its pleasures. How, as we said before, said many times, the limited pleasure that a person, the dangers and the disadvantages of when a person becomes fixated or even somewhat involved in this world when it's not lishma. And as far as the other second area of purification of tahara, which is as far as the divine service, avodas Hashem, he again must think of how worthless it is, how pride is, how the deceits of pride are, and he has to train himself to be boreach, to flee from any kind of covet and honor seeking, and not in any way look through in his divine service to want to get compliments from people. And then, as it says in Devarim, it says, "Hu sihilasacha v'hu elokecha." When a person thinks about Hashem with all his mind, then he gets to the stage of, he is your praise and he is your God. I'm not thinking of anything else. All the praise I want is from Hashem. I don't need other people to recognize me or to think that I'm doing anything very special or out of the ordinary. I'm not looking for the praise in the eyes of man. Now, an interesting thing he says here. One of the means, he's giving you some advice here, one of the means that leads a person to acquiring this trait is preparing yourself for your avoda, for davening. We're talking about avoda, we mean davening, and doing the mitzvahs. In other words, and of course this becomes more and more difficult because the world we live in seems to become more and more accelerated. Everybody has less time for anything, and all of the things that distract us seem to take more and more time. I often feel, don't take this personally, that every computer that leaves the factory should have a little sign on it saying, you can waste your life saving time. We all know the wonderful labor-saving devices that we have that seem to take up all our lives. I don't have to go into details, but we all know what I'm talking about. We know it's a very difficult thing. And therefore it becomes all the more difficult, and because of that, all the more dear, all the more precious, when a person does step back and think, I'm about to do the mitzvah of putting on my tzitzis, about to do the mitzvah of doing the mitzvah of tefillin. When I say the name of Hashem, when I'm davening, I say Shema Yisrael. Before I say Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, and it's the Ikuva, certainly the first paragraph of Kriyat Shema, could be also in Shemona Esrei. When a person is mechav in the name of Hashem, he has to think first. He has to think first that Hashem is master of all, Adon HaKol, and he's Hoya Hova Yiyah. And that's the name Yud Kei Vav Kei. He was, he is, and he will be. And these two thoughts have to be in his mind, and l'choire they should be in his mind before he actually says it, before the word. It could be after the word also, that's also okay. Toch Kadei Dibor, the concept is. Toch Kadei Dibor is a concept in halach that if you do something or you say something, or you correct yourself, let's say if you said the end of, let's for example in Sarasimei Tshuva, you say Hakela Kadosh at the end of the third bracha of Krishma instead of saying Hamelech HaKadosh. So if you catch yourself Toch Kadei Dibor within a certain limited time framework, then that's okay, you don't have to go back to the beginning. What is Toch Kadei Dibor? Toch Kadei Dibor is the time that it would take you to say Shalom Alecha Rabbi Umori. Greetings to you, my master and my teacher. Shalom Alecha Rabbi Umori. Rabbi. That is the length of time which is considered to be, so to speak, all one with the moment. It's all the same moment in time, so to speak. But l'chadchila, we're talking now about preparing ourselves for. So a person, this is halacha l'maisa, a person is not yotzi unless he has this kavanah when he says the Shem Hashem. He has to be before he says Shema Yisrael, he has to be mechavan, I'm being mekabel upon myself, ol malchus shemayim. Because without that, that is the whole mitzvah of Kriya Shema, to accept upon myself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven. So if that's not in my mind, and without going into the halakhic details, most of the time, this is not le'ikuva. It doesn't mean that you didn't do the mitzvah, but the first first line of Kriya Shema, and according to some opinions, the first bracha of Shemona Esrei, the name Hashem has to be, you have to be mechaven. You have to be mechaven. Now, it's interesting. There's a concept of meditation. Meditation is things that go on in your mind. And in Judaism, I think there's a very unique thing, which is it's not just meditation. There's something called premeditation. Now, premeditation has got a bit of a bad rap. We tend to think of premeditation as, somebody has got it in for somebody. He premeditates whatever to do something bad to them, chas v'chalila. But really the word premeditation really means a meditation which takes place before you do an action. And I think I'm right in saying this is a unique thing in Judaism, this idea of kavanah. In religions, other religions, lahavdil, there is an idea of meditation. In fact, there are some in Eastern religions that make a big deal out of it. It's not that it doesn't have a place in Judaism, of course it does. Hisbodedus, as we spoke about in previous weeks, meditation, spending time, considering things. But the idea we're talking about now is a specific idea to premeditate, to, in your mind, to have what are called kavanot, intentions, that before I say a certain word, before I do a certain action, I premeditate. I think about what it is that I'm about to do. And this is exactly what he's talking about here. Before doing anything in terms of Avodas Hashem, that the way a person comes to increase his Avodas Hashem is his tahara, his purity, that translucence. As we said before, the word tahara is connected to the word translucent, light, purity, tahara. So the person who achieves this purity and translucence and his connection with Hashem in this way, he does this by thinking, and specifically a thinking which is a premeditated thinking. And to think before he says, let's say, Shem Hashem, Yud Kei Vav Kei, he thinks to himself for a split second, or as long as it takes you for that matter, that Hashem is Adon HaKol, and he's Hoya Hova Yiyah. He was, he is, and he will be. And when he says Elokeinu, he has to think that Hashem is Bala Koiches Kuloi. He is the master of all powers. There's no independent powers in the world. He is the reason and the siba, the reason for everything, the cause of all causes, the root cause of everything that ever happens. Again, Shema, and then he says again at the end, second Shema rather, same again, that should be, the kavanah should be, and ideally it should be before the name. And then before he says Echad, he should think that Hashem is Echad, is one, and the letter Chet is the seven Yerikot. I forgot the name. The seven heavens, the seven what's the word? Rikiot, thank you, Rikiot. So I'm dyslexic. 7 Rikiot all the way down to Olam Hazeh, which is the 8. That's the Chet, and then the Daled, that Hashem is all master of all 4 compass points, which is this world, and he should move his head in a clockwise direction, starting with the east towards the Beis Hamikdash, if he's in, or here would be, of course, be the south, as he's saying Echad. Now, all of these things actually are quite complex and take time. And there are other kavanas that a person can, and if he can, should have as well when he's saying Kriya Shema. And for example, like when a person says Echad, one of the kavanot of Echad, of that Hashem is one, is that Ein Od Milvado, that nothing else exists apart from Hashem. And we spoke about this in previous weeks. This is a difficult idea. Because if Hashem is one and there's nothing else exists apart from Him, Ein Od Milvado, so then who am I? So we spoke about this in previous weeks, that level of Achdus with Hashem, which is Mesilas Nefesh, is that I give over the deepest sense of my own identity and say that really at the ultimate level, I am no more than one of Hashem's expressions in His world. We spoke about this on Shavuos. Maybe we'll come back to it. But I'm really trying to illustrate, and this is not, I mean, this is just scratching the surface. The idea being that when a person comes to his avodas Hashem, that he should have premeditation. He should think and prepare about what he's doing. And as I said before, it becomes very difficult in our world where everything has to be instant. So this idea of premeditation is essential for Kriya Shema. Without this, the kavanot, a person is not yotzi, he didn't do the mitzvah. There are kulas for the other things. And in point of fact, I recommend there's a siddur which has kavanot Hashem. Sephardi siddurs all have this, but Ashkenazi siddurs don't have it so much. There is a siddur that does have the kavanot, which is Adon HaKol, is a Lord of all. He was, he is, and he will be, printed after every Yud Kei Vav Kei in the Siddur. I'm not quite sure why they print it after. It's a kasha that I have. Really, they should print it before. I have no idea why they print it after. But that's certainly a whole lot better than rushing through. And of course, these things you have to take them slowly. If you just do the first first verse of Kriya Shema and the first paragraph of Shemona Esrei, and spend your time and be mechaven, have premeditation on those names. Not only will you have fulfilled the mitzvah, but as I said before, could be without that you haven't fulfilled the mitzvah. But this leads a person to a tahara, a certain purification, purification, tahara. Tahara machshava, the purity of the thought when he comes to worship Hashem. And this is really what he's been saying here. As he said, of course he's talking about any mitzvah here, but specifically in davening and doing the mitzvahs, then what happens is when he thinks about what I'm doing and in front of whom I'm doing it, I'm doing this in front of Hashem, and then it's interesting, it's very difficult not to think about things. It's very difficult not to think about that Olam Hazeh. What's much easier is thought replacement. It's difficult to tell somebody to say, don't think about X. It's like when you're giving somebody a golf lesson, The worst thing you can say to him is, don't hit it in the sand trap. Why? Because what stays in his mind? Sand trap. But you tell him, hit it on the fairway. So a person should put into his mind these positive kavanot, and he will find automatically that his davening will improve 1,000-fold, because instead of the thoughts of the world which flood a person's head, and what this will be replaced with is the kavanot that he should have, and will help him to purify his machshavas. And it will be easy for him, that's what he's saying today, to get rid of his exterior motives and to plant into his heart the kavanot which are true, emet, and desirable. Now the Gemara says in Brachas Daf Lamed Amud Beis that the Chasidim Rishonim, and again when we're talking about Chasidim, we're not talking about the movement of the Baal Shem Tov, we're talking about the Chasidim Rishonim of the time of the Gemara, and of course Alachas Kam V'Kama, the previous generations. They would spend 3 hours davening, and that's 9 hours a day. They would spend an hour preparing, an hour to go up, so to speak, an hour davening Shemona Esrei, and an hour coming down, re-entry. So, Gemara Sakasha, so, how did they manage to learn? If 9 hours a day would spend, they said that they had a bracha because of this, that everything they learned they remembered. There was no shikha, there was no forgetfulness at all. So they basically learned something once and that was that. Of course, this is like on a level that is almost difficult for us to even comprehend. But again, with many of these things, when a person fixes his gaze on the stars, and maybe he won't get even halfway there, but at least he knows where he's headed to. At least he has a target. And to understand that there were people who walked this world, who lived in physical bodies, who were able to do this, who were able to purify their thoughts to the extent that they spent an hour preparing themselves, an hour in preparing their kavanot, an hour in davening, and an hour to come down. So one can at least understand that even on our level, we should be able to attain at least the most distant glimmer of that level. Yeah, he says, it goes without saying that, of course, it goes without saying that they didn't just, b'vadai shelo hayu ponim sha achas levatola. They didn't stand there thinking for an hour beforehand, thinking about the football results or what they were going to have in the Cheder Achel for dinner and what day of the week it was, and whether we get steak tonight or falafel or whatever it is. Obviously, their minds were full of being mechaven, of preparing themselves. So surely what they were doing basically was to deliberate and to be ready and to meditate, premeditate on the tefillah that was to follow, by casting foreign thoughts from themselves and filling their hearts with the requisite love and fear of Hashem. As it says in Sefer Yov, Im ata hachinoisa libecha uforasta elov kapecha. If you have prepared your heart, then spread out your hands to him. Okay, so now he gave us a very good piece of advice how to, in practice, work on the midah of tahara. The deterrence of this trait, what takes a person away from this? Which, of course, are the opposite of what we said, a lack of attention to preparation, not making oneself aware of the negativeness, the inferior quality of the world, the pursuit of honor, and as he said, right, insufficient preparation for the avodas Hashem. And of course, avodas Hashem means both davening and ma'aseh mitzvah. When a person comes to do a mitzvah, whether it's eating matzah on the first night of Pesach. And of course, for example, matzah is something that you can prepare for not just at the Seder. A person who spends his time even a couple of weeks, a month before, thinking about matzah, thinking about all the symbolism of matzah, then when he actually eats the matzah, the quality of that mitzvah and the tahara that it brings, the purity. Matzah is something which purifies our soul. So the more we put into the thoughts of that, So he says an interesting thing here. As we said, the deterrence, mafsidei hamida, chisron hisbonenus, the lack of introspection on the lackings of this world, and miut, as we said, not enough preparation. Now, the first to seduce the mind, the first to when a person he has a lack of attention to what he needs to do. And he doesn't think enough about the inferior nature of this world. So this seduces the mind. It seduces the mind, it pulls it towards exterior motives. Even if a person is doing avodas Hashem, he's davening what he's doing, that the motives, so to speak, are not of the purest kind. They seduce him if he doesn't spend enough time preparing in the ways we've mentioned. It pulls a person towards, so it becomes, he says, an interesting idea, like an adulterous. Mashiach al pnios ki isha hamana efes asher tachas isha tichas ezorim. That, so to speak, while still living with her husband, she takes in others, takes in strangers. That's how he compares it. Even when he's, so to speak, a person is davening, he's in contact with Hashem. But what's going on in his mind, so to speak, are not literally adulterous, but in terms of his faithfulness to Hashem, in terms of faith, in terms of being with Hashem, so to speak, he's not really with Hashem. Ukava nikra hamachshavos hachitzonos znus halev. It's an expression in Chazal. Literally, znus halev is the immorality of the heart. As it says also in Bamidbar, "V'lo susura achrei levavechem v'achrei einechem asher atem zonim achreihem." There's a concept of znus, of sexual immorality, which is also connected to the idea of avodas Hashem. In this way that we're saying that a person is really not really with Hashem, so to speak, even though he's quote-unquote married to Hashem. But nevertheless, there are other thoughts going on in his head. And of course, because the whole process is basically one which is mental, which is kavanah. So then when a person has thoughts which are not in that way, we can understand how those are called znus halev. Yeah. And as he says, Ki nimsa halev poineh min mabat hashalem. The heart turns away from this perfect view that it should have, asher hayalo lekasher boy, which it had in this connection it should have with Hashem, from this honest outlook, and it enwraps itself with, as we said before, vanities, the falseness of this world. And similarly, miut hachona, insufficient preparation for doing the avoda. Gorem lesichlus hativi. This basically fosters when a person doesn't prepare himself enough, what happens is that his mind is, because the brain is in the body, and the brain is a physical thing, and the mind has to dominate the brain. The whole, as we said this in many different ways, that the whole nature of a person is that his body is like a down escalator. The nature of physicality, by virtue of the fact that it's physical, its tendency is always going to go down. And therefore a person has to constantly fight, and by doing this preparation, he's able to take hold of his mind and guide his mind, which will elevate his thoughts and elevate his whole body. That's what he's saying here. Because achana goyrem, the sichlas, lack of hachana is goyrem the sichlas hativi haba mitzad hachoymesh shelo yigorash mitoichoy, that he can't banish it, he can't be goyresh from himself, this natural physicality. V'darehu mavim esa avoida v'sir chonoi. And he says something very strong here. He says that what happens is this, the indivorceable element of physicality, which is part of man, will befoul, he uses very strong lashon, he befouls the avodas Hashem with its stench. Sir chonoi is like a terrible smell. Okay, so this is the chapter we've done tonight, Baruch Hashem, of chapter 17, Yud Zayin, Darki Kniyas Hatara, and he says, Ata Midas HaChasidus. We're going to go on from Tara to Chasidus, which he translates here in the book as saintliness. I always think the word saintliness sort of has certain kind of Christological overtones. Chassidus we prefer. We're going to talk about Chassidus, and as we said before, really the sole second half of this book is Chassidus, but there's a specific aspect of the second part which we're going to go into with Bezrat Hashem next week and understand that on a better level. Okay.